Hi there, and welcome to the second part of this tutorial on creating a Greek temple in Blender. In the last part of the tutorial, we looked at modeling the basic scene, which you can see here. And to do that, we used a lot of techniques for duplicating meshes over and over again. So for columns and the tiles on the roof, we use duplicates, or duplifaces, sorry. And that's going to come in handy in this part of the tutorial where we move on to creating a render, and we're going to be rendering our temple in cycles. And the advantage that using duplifaces has with cycles is that this creates instances of our object that are exactly the same in every instance, and cycles can then use this to dramatically speed up rendering and building the scene before rendering, allowing you to get less noisy results in a shorter amount of time, which is obviously a good thing. So, first thing we need to do is switch to using cycles as our renderer, and then start building the scene in terms of the materials and our world settings and lighting, and then moving towards getting a final render. So I'll start by setting my render engine to cycles render, and then, working in cycles, quite often a useful thing to do is to split the viewport up and just have a view in the corner that I can set to the rendered preview. This fantastic thing about cycles is it lets you get a real-time preview of what your scene looks like when it's finally rendered. And I'm just going to leave that in the corner to sort of update and give me an idea of what my scene looks like as I go along. Now, at the moment it looks fairly dull. There's some light coming from the background, which is just giving it sort of ambient occlusion type look. And what we want is to create something more like outdoor lighting on a sunny day. So to do that, we'll be using a world light and using the sky texture to create a background that creates the light, and then we'll be compositing in some clouds in the actual background that we'll use in our render. And then for the sunlight, we'll be using a sun lamp and positioning that to get some nice shadows in our scene. But first off, there's something missing from our scene, and that's a camera. So I'm going to add a new camera. I'm going to then take this camera that I created and just using my viewport, get a rough idea of where I want it to go. So I want to be sort of looking roughly at something like that. If I switch to perspective view, I can get a better idea. And then hitting Control-Alt-Naught sets the camera to use the current viewport view, which is often a very useful way of positioning a camera. Because you can navigate the viewport to where you want it to be and then just hit that command and have it be there. So, it looks like I need to increase the clipping distance on my camera just so I can see the whole scene. And I just want to adjust the position ever so slightly. Maybe come in a bit. And look slightly more up, so I'm just sort of rotating and moving the camera. And then what I might do is stamp my cursor to the middle of the temple. So choose an object with its origin, roughly in the middle of where I want. And then by setting my pivot point to 3D cursor, I can rotate the camera around the temple like that. So I just want to get a good view of the inner door to that temple. I think that'll do. So the next step is to start creating some materials and assigning those to my scene and creating some lighting. And I think actually, because I've got this cycles render preview here, that I'd rather have the lighting first. So for that, I'm going to create a sun lamp. So I've created a sun lamp here, and pretty instantly you can see that my render in cycles is updated, and there's now a bit of directional lighting, although not a lot. So what I want to do here is for my sun lamp, just set it to a slightly orangish colour, more like sunlight, and then rotate that lamp so that I get some nice shadows on my temple. Now if I switch my render preview to use the camera view as well, I can then see which way the light is facing a bit easier. One thing I'm noticing is that the shadows from my sun are looking very, very soft. And that's because of this size setting for the shadows on the sun. If I take that down to 0.05, maybe 0.03, you can now see that the shadows cast by the pillars are a lot sharper. And I think that looks a bit better. So now I can just rotate that lamp around, try and find an angle I like that gives some interesting shadows. So that's my sunlight setup. I might just turn up its strength a little bit to give it the right look. And then this is all looking very orange at the moment, and that's because there's no blue light from the sky coming in to light up the shadows and change the colour temperature of the scene back to be a bit more neutral. So for that, I'm going to change my world settings here. Just turn on use node, so I'm creating a proper cycles material. And then if I switch to the compositing view, I can then switch this to a viewport render and switch my node editor to be working on materials and then my world material. And instead of this grey background, what I want is to add in a texture, sky texture, and connect that up to my background node. And pretty instantly you can see that this has changed the nature of my scene and made it look a lot more natural. I'm just going to take that down to maybe 7. That looks about right. And slightly adjust the direction of this sky light texture. And that looks about right for me. And I think maybe to complement the pinky texture of that background, I might just add a little more red sun lamp. Maybe more of a reddish orange, maybe it's coming up towards sunset or something like that. And I think I'm reasonably happy with the lighting. And you can see that all this time, even though I've got a screen recording going, I'm getting pretty fast results with cycles here. And that's because I set up my scene to use instancing. So every one of these meshes on the tiles and for the columns are exactly the same. And you don't get this result with using arrays to duplicate a mesh, or if you just simply hit Shift-D or even Alt-D to create a duplicate and then apply different modifiers to it. It's got to be something that is exactly the same. And the ways you can do that are with particle systems, or with duplifaces, dupliverts, something like that. So these are the best ways to sort of approach making repeated objects if you're going to render a complicated scene in cycles. So it's something to be aware of. Alright, well my scene's starting to look pretty good now. It's pretty basic. What I might want to do is just add a basic material to all of my objects. And to do that, I'm going to turn on an add-on called Material Utils. And this provides some really great tools for just quickly adding materials to a whole bunch of objects at once. Basically, if I switch back to normal view here, and select all the objects in my temple, just drag a lasso around them. I can hit Q, assign material, add new, and it adds the same material to every single object in my selection. So it's a really fast way of working with materials, really great for sort of getting a basic scene set up and adjusting a lot of materials at once. So I'm going to set this to be a diffuse shader, maybe turn the roughness up to 0.1 just so I get some aura and IR shading and not lambda. And to be honest, I think that looks okay. Maybe I'll make it ever so slightly grayer. I'm pretty happy with white actually. So the next step is to just do a bit of compositing on my final render and then render something a bit less noisy. So let's switch to my node setup for rendering. And first off, I'm going to add in a background. So this is just a sky texture that I grabbed off cgtextures.com. If I open it up, you can see that I've taken a sky texture, one of the large ones, and just cropped it to the right size, and then done a bit of removal on the bottom here to take out some trees and buildings that were in the bottom of the view. That was just in GIMP using the clone tools and things like that. I won't go into that too deeply. And then to combine the two together, I'm just going to go to color alpha over and add an alpha over node. Select my background as the first input and then my scene as the second. And then to make sure that I render a render with a transparent background that can then be composited on top of that cloud texture image, I'm going to turn on transparent in my render options, and you can see here in my preview that I now have a transparent background to my circles render, so that when I render properly, I'll have something with an alpha that I can composite over. So now I think I need something I can start working with in the compositor, so I want to create a proper render. So if I set my render size to 100% and set my render samples to say 500, that should be enough to get rid of most of the noise, and hit F12, I can start off a render, and I will return when this has finished. Alright, our render's finished, and the composite looks something like this. There's still a tiny bit of noise here, but I'm not going to concern myself with that. We can just render again with a few more samples once we're finished. So all I want to do for this render is maybe add a bit of bloom and then do a tiny bit of color grading, and then I'm going to call that one finished. Perhaps I'll add a slight vignette to my image as well. So to do that, I'm going to go back to my node setup. And just turn off the cycles preview there, because now I'm working with a finished render anyway. And then to do a bit of bloom, I'm going to create a blur filter and plug in my image into that, and then do colors mix and add the result back onto the original. So if I connect my viewer to that, currently it looks like this, which isn't too useful. So the first thing I want to do is add in an RGB curves node and just take down the amount, or rather tweak the curves so that there's a bit of extra contrast in there. And then I'm going to set the type of blur to fast Gaussian and set the radius to, say, 50. Maybe even 80 pixels. How does that look? So that's added rather a lot of light at the moment, so I'm just going to turn that down to 0.1, 2, 3. I think 0.2 is about the right region. I'll just add some extra light and shadows, and adds a bit of a post-processed feel. And then the next step is to do a bit of a vignette. So if I take a blur node and a lens distortion node, I can chain these up to make a quick way of creating a vignette. So if I take the alpha of my background, which is all just black, or white, sorry, and store that factor of 1, then that turns that background into basically a white circle and a black background. And then I can use the blur node to blur the result of that. So set that to fast Gaussian, and I'm going to set that to relative, and just turn on one of the aspect correction options, it doesn't really matter which, and set the blur amount to 50% on that, and that creates a nice sort of dark corner in the image. And then I'm just going to use multiply to multiply that back with the composite that I have so far. And that's added a little bit of a vignette to my image. I might just tweak the curves of that, so make it slightly darker in the corners, but brighter over all, and then turn down the amount of the vignette so slightly. So 0.6. It's not too distracting. Good to keep it reasonably subtle. And then I will add a color balance node, which is just a nice way to tweak the colors of your image slightly. And usually it's a nice way to add some color harmony to your image. So I'm just going to set the lift color to be slightly blue, again to be slightly orangish, and see how that looks. And maybe just deepen the shadows ever so slightly by turning the value on the game down a bit. And lower the highlights a bit, just because when I did that adding in some extra light, it's blown out the highlights very slightly. Okay, and that's starting to look like my final image. It's all pretty basic. There are some things I want to change though. First off, the pitch of this roof is looking a bit high. I think, I could stand to make that a bit shorter, a bit narrower. I think Greek temples tend to have fairly shallow roofs, so I might just fix that quickly. And then also, these columns are all facing in the same direction currently, and so the details that I've added in, this offset here on each pillar, is looking very repetitive. And that's very easy to get rid of just by rotating the column duplicate faces, mesh faces into different directions so that the columns all point in different directions. So let's just very quickly do that and then re-render it and get something a bit more final. So if I switch back to my default view, the pitch of the roof, if I just hide that mesh first and jump onto this one, I'm going to shift that down to roughly the height I want the roof to be. Just in object mode. And then these parts, if I select cursor to left selected, and just put my cursor at the end of the roof, I can then set my pivot point to 3D cursor, just rotate that down, and then hopefully if I set my orientation to normal, I can also scale that down slightly. And rather than do the same for the other side, I'm just going to delete the other side, and then duplicate and mirror the side that I've got right, and then move down this top piece here. And it looks like just need to bring these in very slightly. There we go. And then for the tiles, I'm going to do the same thing. And this time I will sort of rotate individually for each side, because each side is just a duplicate. So if I sort of rotate and scale this down, I just noticed I accidentally scaled it on the long axis, which I didn't to do. That's a slightly flatter roof, so I'm going to zoom in just to get my original sort of composition back how it was. And then for these columns that are all looking, like they're all facing the same way at the moment, I'm just going to jump into edit mode, and if I switch to face mode and then set my pivot point as individual origins, I can use the select random option and select, say, 25% of my faces at random, and if I just hit slash on the numpad, go into local view, so I can just view this object that I'm working on. I'm going to choose a bit more spaced out faces to rotate, just because the random option, sometimes selects a big clump altogether. And then simply hit R90, rotate those 90 degrees, and then select a few faces at random again. And do -90, rotate those, and try and select some different random faces again. And this time, rotate 180 degrees. There we go. So now all my pillars have been ever so slightly randomized just by making them all facing different directions. So now I'm going to go and re-render again. And I think that's going to be roughly my final image. Alright, so our render's finished and gone through the compositor again, and we've made some adjustments and things. And that's about where I'm going to leave it. So in the course of this tutorial, we've looked at taking curves and converting this into a model for our pillar, and then creating some variation and building this out, and then using duplifaces to create our temple by duplicating the same pillar mesh over and over again, and using some simple geometry to flesh in the rest of the temple, and using duplifaces once more to do the tiles on the roof. And then in the second part of the tutorial, we looked at rendering this with cycles using and taking advantage of the fact that we're using instances to speed up our rendering, and finally doing a little bit of compositing and setting up the world correctly, and making a couple of modifications to our model. So I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. It's been fairly simple. I hope it's been a good introduction to correct, or at least a good way to approach creating multiple copies of an object and rendering them quickly in Blender with cycles. And if you've got any questions, leave them in the comments. Alright, thanks very much.